On behalf of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, welcome to the first of the Future of Workers Dialogue series. My name is Ruth Castel Branco. I'm the research manager for the Future of Workers research project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, and I will be chairing this very topical discussion titled The Fourth Industrial Revolution, a Critical Framing. The concept of the Fourth Industrial Revolution has become increasingly popular. From academic to policy to civil society circles, there seems to be a growing sense that we are on the cusp of a digital technological revolution, which will fundamentally change the way in which we live, we work, and we relate to one another. However, some contend that the concept of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is more aspiration than it is reality, driven by a glorified, capital-friendly, and historically deterministic view of technological innovation. The Future of Workers Research Project, which is financed by the Ford Foundation, the IDRC, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, is especially interested in the ways in which digital technologies are reshaping the world of workers and the implications for inequality. To this end, we've put together a Future of Workers dialogue series on the third Tuesday of every month, from now until the end of the year, from 3:30 till 5 p.m. South African Standard Time. To help frame our debate on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we're privileged to have a distinguished panel of speakers and discussants: Nanjala Nyabola, Dr. Trevor Ngwane, Dr. Ian Moll, and Tessa Dooms. Without further ado, I would like to invite Nanjala Nyabola to offer her reflections. Nanjala is an independent writer and researcher based in Nairobi, Kenya. Her work focuses on the intersection between technology, media, and society. She holds a BA in African Studies and Political Science from the University of Birmingham, an MSc in African Studies, and an MSc in Forced Migration, both from the University of Oxford, as well as a JD from Harvard Law School. Nanjala writes commentary for publications like The Nation, Al Jazeera, the Boston Review, and others. She is also the author of Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, published by Zed Books in 2018, and Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move, published by Hearst Books in 2020. And we'll put a link to both those books in the chat. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Nanjala Nyabola. Thank you so much for joining us and helping us frame our thinking around the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Welcome.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be part of this seminar series, and I am really excited to engage with some of the other speakers and obviously the other people on the call as we try to think through some of these bigger ideas that are framing our conversations about technology. I wanted to preface my comments by obviously introducing myself a little bit more. I know that a lot of people, when they look at some of the work that I do, they always get confused. They're like, what does she actually do? There's so many different threads. I like to say that I'm a storyteller. More than anything else, my focus is on using stories and narrative to shift perceptions of key issues around the world, specifically technology and migration, and trying to get people to think deeper about some of the things that we take for granted when we throw around ideas and concepts, without necessarily unpacking what it is that we are invoking, what it is that we're bringing into the room. And that's part of the reason why I was very keen to be part of this seminar, because I think the Fourth Industrial Revolution is an idea that has been deployed, especially here in the African continent, that has been routinely deployed uncritically, without sort of stopping to take stock about what it is that we're invoking and what it is that we're bringing into the room. So as a storyteller, yes, there's an element of, the technical knowledge and sort of grappling with the more operational or procedural, the nuts and bolts of what it is that we think about when we are building technology. But then there's also I'd like to think of this as an effort to give context and to give depth to some of the things that maybe as we are building technology, as we're advancing technology, as we're advancing specific ideas about technology, we don't always give ourselves time to think about. And this obviously has a lot to do with this desire and this decontextualization that technology has invited in our public lives, that we are increasingly living in a moment where technology is invoked as some kind of catch-all for all of the solutions the many of solutions that are available to us as we're thinking about addressing some of the complicated issues that are underway in our society. So I want to approach this introduction of these conversations as a storyteller and sort of taking a step back from the technical aspects of thinking about the fourth industrial revolutions and thinking about it from the perspective of what it makes possible, what it makes impossible, what it constrains, what it enables, and where does that leave us as people who are in the African continent. The fourth industrial revolution is a narrative frame that has increasing currency in many policy circles, certainly in the African continent. It's been embraced by the African Union as an ordering or organizing principle. It's been embraced by several other regional organizations as an approach towards ordering both private lives, both economic and political lives of the people who are on the continent. So as a narrative frame, what a narrative frame is basically a framework for organizing multiple layers of knowledge, of information, of connection, and of relation. A narrative framework is basically about the story, the meta-narrative, the story about the story that we tell ourselves. A narrative frame is a box in which our ideas, as I said, of what is possible and what is constrained are contained. And it tells us what lines of action we should be pursuing or are feasible or are implementable within the framework that we operate. The fourth industrial revolution as a narrative frame involves ideas of progress, right? From what we were to where we want to be, but also progress measured in very specific terms: growth, development, GDP, GDP, thinking about gross development, thinking about economics, thinking about money as the measure of what we think about progress. We're measuring ourselves relative to what we see as industrialized nations, as wealthy nations, and how we can leapfrog and towards where those countries are today. And that is the second thing that this narrative frame invokes, this idea of leapfrogging, of jumping over the difficulties that lie ahead of us, that if we pursued a certain development track, we would be stuck in specific challenges and would be mired in specific challenges for an extended period of time. But this fourth industrial revolution brings with it this idea of leapfrogging because of this historical idea that the previous industrial revolution, the revolutions, allowed societies to leapfrog over certain difficulties and enter into a state of being advanced economies, of relative wealth distribution, of relative prosperous societies. The third idea that this narrative frame invokes is this idea of mechanization or automation, which is, again, when we study economics or we study political history, we always learn about how the cotton gin, for example, allowed cloth production to take off and allowed people to accelerate the production of textiles and reorganized the feudal economy, because now the farmers didn't need that many, there was less need for manual labor in the cotton gins, and people were able to produce fabric at a much grander scale. And this brought with us consolidation of wealth, but also allowed people who are of the lower classes to enter into the formal economy in a much more direct way. So reducing the burden and the need for feudalism and sort of this fundamental reorganization of Western economies. And so the idea of automation and mechanization is also embedded in this notion of the fourth industrial revolution. The narrative frames are important because they allow us to order our action as disparate units, as people who are spread across different geographies, ages, communities, societies. These narrative frames allows us to independently come to the same conclusion. So they order our actions, they give us a pathway that we follow in order to achieve that, these leapfrogging, these ideas of progress and these ideas of development. Narrative frames also allow us to order a knowledge, as I said before, that we exist in a state of constantly being bombarded with different strands of ideas. You know, there's so many different ideas about what's wrong with Africa, what's good about Africa, how does Africa get free, how does Africa achieve independence? And having a narrative frame allows us to order this knowledge so that we can filter through those ideas much quickly and come up with, as I said before, a plan of action, how it is that we're going to achieve this leapfrogging and this forward momentum. And most importantly, perhaps, these narrative frames, they create an ideology, right? They give us something to believe in. They give us something to work towards. They give us ideas about what we can accept and what we can reject about what confronts us. What are the problems that confront us? You see this in action very much when you think about how institutions like the African Union are approaching their digitalization strategy. There's this idea that we're going to have this apolitical approach. We're going to focus solely on creating an enable environment for technology and for embracing technology in all aspects of multilateralism, of international organization on the continent. And that's going to allow us to leapfrog over all of these other challenges, whether it's conflict, whether it's drought, whether it's hunger, whether it's bad governance. All of these other issues don't fit into the narrative frame of this fourth industrial revolution. So it allows this ideology, this apolitical ideology, that the only obstacle between progress, between where we are now and where we want to be, is embracing technology in this multifaceted way and ordering our energy towards that embrace of technology without having to confront these other more complicated questions. And you can obviously divine what the advantages are of operating in this way, that it allows people to work across difference, you know, as Africa's second largest continent, and now this ideology of this fourth industrial revolution being put forward as a unifying ideology of a plan of work around which all of our different actions can be ordered. And the real seduction of this idea is obviously that it's apolitical, that we can talk about development and we can talk about progress and we can talk about forward momentum without having to grapple with power and with politics, and of course, embedded in that, the idea of power. This narrative frame allows us to look on the world and not see injustice and not see inequality, but see that imagine that the only obstacle that lies between where we are today and where we want to be in 5, 10, 15 years is our own initiative, is our own capacity to work, is our own capacity to allow ourselves to be taken up by the power of this narrative. Apolitical narratives are particularly seductive in contexts such as ours on the continent, where politics can be very fraught and where past histories of injustice and exploitations often go unconfronted. Even present histories of injustice and inequality go unconfronted. And this makes this narrative frame of a fourth industrial revolution particularly seductive, that we don't have to confront the harm that we have inflicted on each other or the harm that has been inflicted on us. We can just focus on facing forward and not necessarily sitting in the discomfort of the injustices that surround us. By now, it should be clear, if you're listening, that I am a bit of a skeptic for this approach of thinking about progress and development. I wanted to begin by showing what I think draws people to this framework of this fourth industrial revolution. I can see why it is seductive for policymakers and for people who work in technology to run towards this idea, because it enables so much work and it enables so much the illusion of moving forward. But I think it's a limiting ideology. I think eventually we find ourselves boxed into lines of work, these coordinated ideologies and these coordinated lines of action that are leading us towards a cul-de-sac, because they preclude the possibility of complexity, of discomfort that is necessary towards making sure that we don't repeat the past mistakes of the Industrial Revolution. Embedded in the previous industrial revolutions are deeper questions that must also be confronted, not least of which, and probably in keeping with the theme of the seminar, one is inequality, and inequality on a global scale. the story of the cotton gin in the United Kingdom is incomplete without thinking about the exploitation that happened in India, where most of the cotton that was being processed in the United Kingdom came from, and what was enabled in order to make that increased consumption of cotton possible, which is imperialism, and by extension, exploitation, consumption of natural resources in India for the benefit of the United Kingdom. These kinds of injustices, we are still facing the very real threat of replicating these injustices because we don't want to sit in the discomfort of what these narrative frames make possible. Is accelerated, quote unquote, development at this pace possible without any kind of exploitation or injustice? I don't think we've spent enough time grappling with that question. And so there isn't a satisfactory answer on the table right now. We're just kind of powering forward because we have this ideology that allows us to skip through these questions. So these are the three things that I wanted to leave you with in terms of the challenges of this as a narrative frame. One is, as I said, apolitical narratives don't allow us to confront underlying challenges squarely. They don't allow us to name the beast, and therefore that makes it difficult for us to tame the beast. What is it that this particular narrative frame, what injustices does it make possible? I'll give you the example of digital ID, which has been upheld by developing countries and international multilateral organizations as part of this fourth industrial revolution, as a preceding quality or as a preceding task for making the fourth industrial revolution possible. The idea of digitalization of identities, of capturing people's identities on digital platforms, and then transforming that into data that can be monetized. Well, the challenge with a lot of the digital ID projects that are being rolled out in the world today is that they are compounding exclusion. They are compounding pre-existing exclusion in various societies. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a taxonomy of people and organize people in the taxonomy that makes sense for the tech, that makes the tech work. And in so doing, creating certain forms of violence that are much more difficult to identify. So one example that has stayed with me since I started thinking about digital ID is this idea of fingerprints and biometrics. Well, we are told that the science of biometrics is neutral, it's apolitical. We all have fingerprints, we all have irises that can be scanned, we all have earlobes that can be scanned. However, even people who work in biometrics will tell you that the science in biometrics isn't as settled as the policymakers who are advancing biometrics would want us to believe. There are millions of people around the world who lose their fingerprints inadvertently through actions like taking hot pots off an open flame, which I think many of our grandmothers on this call would have done when cooking. You just grab the pot and take it off because we don't really have oven mitts. That tends to burn people's fingerprints off. And so this presumption that everybody has a fingerprint, and therefore fingerprints can be captured by the tech, and therefore everybody can have digital ID, and therefore digital ID can function as a barrier to entitlements and to state protection. All this chain of thinking is embedded in that is a pre-existing exclusion, is a pre-existing injustice that this narrative of fourth industrial revolution doesn't want to see. Doesn't want to sit in the discomfort of the fact that the pre-existing conditions make this wholesale assumptions of who can participate in the digital economy or the digital society, that we don't want to confront that there are actually millions of people all around the world who can't participate. And the real life consequences in India is that farmers started to commit suicide because their data couldn't be captured, and therefore they were being denied state benefits as farmers, as people who were in the working classes of India. You saw the people in Assam being wholesale made stateless at the drop of a hat because the data, the way in which the Industrial Revolution, the idea of datafication functions, automatically excluded millions of people. The second thing that this narrative frame, the second challenge I want to put forward about this narrative frame is that it doesn't allow us to challenge the politics that created the inequality and injustice that I just referred to. So we say that data is the new oil, and datafication will allow us to advance, specific political economic ideals. But we don't confront the idea that sometimes governments want to exclude people. And it's a bad thing that they want to do that, but there are always minority classes in every society in the world in which there is a pre-embedded desire to exclude. This is the challenge that we had in Kenya with the Somali population, with the Nubian population, who have been denied ID cards since the independence period because of the politics of borders and inclusion and exclusion in Kenya. And so when they introduced the new digital ID system, the Huduma number, they said to us, well, this Huduma number will remove the need for vetting and will remove the need for all of these qualifiers that have made it difficult for Somali and Nubian people to get IDs in the first place. But of course, Somali people and Nubian people, it's not that they don't have IDs because they don't want them. It's because the government doesn't want it to be easy for them. The obstacle between Somali people and Nubian people and full civic rights in Kenya is not the lack of technology. It's the lack of political will. It's that desire to exclude. And you see this with minority populations all over the world. I've mentioned Muslim community in Assam in India. You'll see this with indigenous populations in the United States, the Roma populations of Europe, that the tech is not the problem. It's the desire to exclude, the politics of exclusion that's the problem. And one cannot be substituted for the other, because what you end up doing is compounding the harm. Right now in Kenya with the Huduma number, asking Somali people, making it a prerequisite that you have a national ID card to get a Huduma number, but then you don't want to give the Somali people ID cards without the extra additive vetting. Well, what you're saying is now, because it's going to be tech and we're going to take out those difficult questions, we're going to say, well, the tech is going to take care of it. It's neutral, it's apolitical. And if you're not captured by the system, it's not the tech's fault. It's your fault that you haven't reached the threshold of data that is needed to make the tech work for you. And this ties to the last point that I want to leave you with, which is, this idea of what was it that exploitation and injustice was, as I mentioned, embedded in our previous iterations of the Industrial Revolution. And I fear that as we've embraced this idea of the fourth Industrial Revolutions, we're actually replicating some of these underlying notions of exploitation and extraction uncritically. One obvious way is through our relationship with the natural environment. Of course, one of the previous Industrial Revolution also brought in hand this spike in the consumption of the natural environment, this unchecked use of the natural environment, and this distortion in our relationship between people and nature. And the consequences are everywhere: climate change, drought, famine, all of these distortions that are a consequence of this spike in consumption. And when we think about the fourth Industrial Revolution, we don't really give ourselves time to confront what the consequences of this distortion would be in this digital age. One example that always jumps out to me is Bitcoin, and not necessarily Bitcoin specifically, but digital currencies, right? Cryptocurrencies. I'm always struck by the fact that when we talk about, putting things on the blockchain and putting a digital IDs on the blockchain and putting all of these things on the blockchain, the fact that we don't really interrogate what it means to put to the environmental consequences of embracing technology uncritically in this way. And then tied to that is obviously the people component of it. Was the Industrial Revolution in Europe possible without slavery? Would it have been possible without imperialism? Would it have been impossible without that expansionism? This is a question that when it comes to tech, we aren't really leaning into it. But I'm glad that increasingly African researchers, Asian researchers, people from the global South are pushing back against this framework of data as the new oil, that we exist to be extracted, we exist to be turned into data points that can be then turned into currency. I keep coming back to that phrase, data is the new oil, because the Indian government has put it forward as a justification of its datafication policies. The Kenyan government has done the same when they were creating the digital ID project. They literally gave it as a justification. Data is the new oil. If you look at the policy documents that are coming out of especially the African Union, but other regional organizations thinking about advancing digital as the solution to all of the problems, there isn't this critical interrogation of the exploitation that unchecked these unchecked policies are making possible. We've actually embraced it. We're actually saying, well, it's just your data, it's not you. But of course, that's not true. Your fingerprints are part of you. Your iris scans are part of you. Your identity is part of you. Identification will bring human risks to it and will bring social risks to it. And this is my critique of this fourth industrial revolution as a narrative frame. I think it's incomplete. I think it misrepresents the relationship between the human and the data that they generate. I think it's a very narrow way of conceptualizing progress and development. And I think it risks repeating the challenges and the problems that we've faced in previous iterations of the Industrial Revolution. I think we need to take stock. And as I said, it's why I'm glad to be part of conversations like this, because I think we're not saying that we are against technology. We're not saying that we don't want to embrace technology or we don't want to use technology to enhance our social lives, but we have to keep things in order. We are not our data, we are people. So thank you.
Thank you, Nanjala, for pushing us to kind of take a step back and think about this question of narrative frames, and pointing to the fact that narrative frames like 4IR so often help to deflect us from the root causes of inequality and enable these ongoing processes of expropriation, exploitation, and exclusion. Next up, we have Dr. Trevor Ngwane, who is a scholar activist from anti-apartheid days to the present. He obtained his PhD at the University of Johannesburg in sociology. His long career is a combination of academic research and scholarship and active engagement in social and political activism. He's worked for the Transport and General Workers Union, which is a COSATU affiliate, the Anti-Privatization Forum, and the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee. He has co-edited a book with Malehoko Chwedi, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, a sociological critique, which was published by Jacana Press in 2021. His book, Amakomiti, Grassroots Democracy in South Africa's Shack Settlements, was published by Pluto Press and Jacana Media in 2021. He is currently employed as a senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg, where he also serves as the director of the Center for Sociological Research and Practice. Welcome, Dr. Trevor Ngwane. And to participants, we are going to have a Q&A after the presentation, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to the previous speaker. I've titled my talk, Marxism, Freedom, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I was thanking the previous speaker for saying some of the issues which, I think are important in discussing this topic. So my name is Trevor Guane, as the chairperson indicated, and I come from UJ. Some of you know this. The University of Johannesburg, has chosen primarily through the championship of its Vice Chancellor, Professor Marwala, to be the leader, in technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So in fact, the identity of our institution, and even our daily work is very much mired in Fourth Industrial Revolution talk, thinking, and technologies. So in a way, we are getting the Fourth Industrial Revolution from the horse's mouth, because some of you might know that our Vice Chancellor is the Vice Chairperson of the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And that the chairperson of that Presidential Commission is our President, Cyril Ramaphosa. So our Vice Chancellor, is key in this drive, to get this country to move, and respond to this technological development. So the first question is, what is the fourth industrial revolution? So I'm not going to answer this question primarily through a reference to technologies, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, the rest. But I'm going to suggest something which the previous speaker actually was talking about, that the fourth industrial revolution, it's a discourse, it's a paradigm, it's an argument, it's an assertion, it's an observation about what is going on with our society, what is going on in the world of work, and what we should expect moving forward in terms of our economies, indeed, including political and social lives. Now, there is a hegemonic understanding, which is, I would say, ahistorical, decontextualized, and then also technicist in the sense that there is an element of technological determinism. So, when people think of the fourth industrial revolution, they also think of, there was a first industrial revolution, then there was a second industrial revolution, then a third, now we're in the fourth. So, this development, these stages, it almost sounds like a progression and evolution, which is inevitable, unavoidable, inexorable. And indeed, if it's like that, it must be good for all. Who can question something which, is moving according to the laws of nature, the laws of history, the laws of technology. But I think myself and the speaker before me, probably and other speakers too, we take a critical understanding. So we think that, this discourse, it's located in history. It should be contextualized. It's arising at a certain time period in the development of modern society, of capitalist society. Also, this discourse, this paradigm, it's socially determined. It's got certain social interests tied to it. It's promoting a certain vision, a certain way of doing things, which will benefit certain people, not all. And as such, it has got social consequences. And then, of course, if you view it in terms of the economy, then clearly the fourth industrial revolution as a discourse and as a reality in terms of the various technologies which are associated with it, it reflects the technological dynamism of capitalism. So what is happening is the development of this mode of production, this way of organizing production, organizing society, in terms of private property, wage labor, competition, and all those attributes of the capitalist system. So now I want to talk about the fourth industrial revolution and the struggle for freedom from exploitation and oppression. And in doing this, I'm inspired by something which the writer Arundhati Roy wrote about the pandemic in 2020. Indeed, something that David Harvey also wrote about the pandemic. There is no question we are living in pandemic times. So, but the spirit of Arundhati's article was that we shouldn't just moan the bad things which the pandemic is actually bringing, but we should also see it as a platform, as opening certain possibilities of moving forward in our quest to build a better world. The same attitude and approach is taken by David Harvey, who actually spent some time discussing, technological developments associated with the fourth industrial revolution with a view towards finding alternatives to the kind of society we are living in. So, for example, he points out that, yes, it's true that many workers, especially, retail workers, etc., healthcare workers had to go to work, but some workers, many workers lost their jobs, but some people were working from home. Can you see? So working from home has got its challenges, but it also indicates that it is possible to work without the boss, for example, breathing down your neck. So there are certain new ways of looking at work, of understanding what is work, what is the workplace, which the pandemic, brought to us. And the use of certain technologies, as we are doing today, opens other possibilities in this quest for a better world. So what I want to emphasize is that, yes, there are serious problems with this discourse. I can tell you, at UJ, as a lecturer, when you feel your, KPIs, when you are evaluated for promotion, for a possible increment in your wages, you must indicate how you have incorporated the fourth industrial revolution in your teaching, in your research, in your writing. So I think also we do experience, that thing whereby certain, research funds tend to be clustered around the topics of the fourth industrial revolution. So, from that kind of imposition, we kind of feel a bit negative towards, that. But what I want to talk about here is, that search for what is possible. Yes, what is necessary to be done, but what is possible? So we must search for alternatives. I will quote Karl Marx, who says, human beings make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They don't make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. In other words, Marx is encouraging us, to look at the possibilities which are existing in present society in our quest to build a different society. So what is happening with present society? It is capitalism, and we all know that it is a system in crisis. We saw in the economic meltdown in 2008, the pandemic made things worse. There are so many problems. At this very moment, there is a war, with Ukraine being attacked by Russia. There are so many problems going on, unemployment, poverty, etc. Now, Marx said, one of the reasons why capitalism is a crisis-ridden system is that production methods clash with ownership methods. So, we produce as a group collectively, but the ownership is private property, is the one guy, the factory owner, who benefits the most. Secondly, technological improvements benefit only a few because of this private ownership. And also, society advances in many respects, but, strange enough, there is less freedom for the majority. I'm not saying for everyone. For certain pockets, classes, there is more freedom, but mostly for the majority, these advancements don't translate to a better life, to happiness, to joy. But these crises, as I've argued, open the possibility of change for the better. Because often when people are feeling under pressure, they start to search, is there another way we can do this? Is there a way out of this hardship we are facing? Now, when it comes to technology and capitalism, I'll read Marx's quote there. The transformation of the production process from the simple labor process into a scientific process subjugates the forces of nature and compels them to work in the service of human needs. Now, it appears as a quality of fixed capital of the machines, in contrast to living labor. Thus, all the powers of labor are transposed into the powers of capital. The knowledge and scientific expertise now lies within the machine under the command of the capitalists. So in other words, all these machines, these technologies, these computers, if you look at the history of capitalism, what happened when capitalism started, factory production, you'll find that it is living human labor, who built these machines. It is living human labor, its thoughts, its ideas, its imagination, which makes possible all these new technology. So now all that is now embodied in the machine, which is owned by the capitalists. Now it appears alienated from the worker and as the property of the capitalist. In other words, there is a immanent expropriation of knowledge by the capitalists. So now we have what I call the thinking machine. Okay, artificial intelligence, is one key technology, of the fourth industrial revolutions. So now these new technologies and this knowledge becomes embedded, in the machine rather than in the brain of the worker. And consequently, the worker is pushed aside and becomes a mere appendage of the machine, a machine minder. So of course, the advancement of technology is not all bad. There are certain good things, possibilities. For example, increase in productivity, so less workers can do more in less time. Less boredom, drudgery, if the machines can sweep the floors, why should human beings sweep the floor? And then increase health and safety. Imagine in the mines, if the machines could be the ones going into the danger, and then also more free time for human beings. But of course, the constraint is that these benefits are monopolized by the capitalist class. This is my last slide. So I'm going to talk a bit about what Edward Webster calls Uberization, but I'm going to look at it from the point of view of how Marx, in a way, was correct, because if you look at the condition of Uber drivers, they are free, the driver chooses which trip to take, etc. So, what we see happening actually is increasing capitalist freedom. Freedom defined by the capitalists, as defined by Marx, free to work or free to starve. Okay, so it's the development of that logic. And then we see the creation of new realities, new needs, new ways of thinking. And then we see the reorganization of inequalities, oppressions, and exploitations. Many people say, no, even though some jobs are going to be lost, other jobs, are going to arise, But if you look at Uber, there are certain specific oppressions, exploitations, which are new to us, to the working class, to capitalism. So what has been the working class movement's response? It has been slow, weak, defensive. Dr. Mondli Hlatshwayo at UJ writes a lot about this. And then also, the trade union leaders are stuck, what I can call in capitalist logic and thinking, more increase, and then they leave the machines, they leave the technology, into the prerogative of the management. So my suggestion is we should look forward, in the spirit of Arundhati Roy, of David Harvey. We should defend, what we have, maybe also fight for the basic income grant for those who are suffering, demand more, advance. We should broaden the struggle, and then actually we should fight for workers' power, because as long as the technology is in the hands of the bosses, it will be used against, the majority of the working class, rather than serving workers, indeed serving humanity. So we have to dare to dream, follow Marx's injunction, whereby we fight for a different society, socialism. So thank you very much. Asante. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for your presentation and for spotlighting the questions of ownership, who benefits and who loses from technological innovation, and what are the political possibilities for a contentious working class politics in claiming back surplus value in various forms from capital. Next up is Dr. Ian Moll. Ian is a research fellow at the Center for Researching Education and Labor at the University of the Witwatersrand. His interests lie in learning and pedagogy, the network society, and educational technology. His PhD is in cognitive science from the University of Geneva, and he's the former visiting professor at Makerere University, where he was the lead researcher in the Pan-African Agenda on the pedagogic integration of ICTs. His latest publication is The Myth of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Implications for Teacher Education. Welcome, Ian.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I've got on the screen 4 claims, and these claims are central to the writing that I've been doing over the past 2 years about this notion of a fourth industrial revolution. So I work very strongly with a strong claim that says there is no such phenomenon as the fourth industrial revolution, but there is an ideology that styles itself as an ideology about the coming or the being of a fourth industrial revolution. So I make these 4 claims in different ways in the writing I've done. And let me just say up front, I'm very aware that I'm challenging Althusserian theory of ideology here, and we can talk about that later if needs be. The other thing that I want to do in the presentation today is to actually go to the questions that the Southern Centre suggested we try and tackle in these presentations. And I want to say in particular, I'm going to engage that first question today. Is this a new mode of production? And I'm going to talk theoretically about that notion a bit later and try and share some ideas that I have in a developing argument in this regard. I'm talking in this presentation about the publications that I've produced in the last 2 years. They are on screen there, but I've also put them into the chat forum for you to look at, so I won't spend too much time here. Here is the claim that I'm making, and I'm going to point the claim at issues about the North, the global North, and then in a minute I'll say something about the global South. Now, basically the claim that I'm making is that there is no transition at the level of a total social revolution. And I think it's very important that we understand that the fourth industrial revolution, or the third one, or the second one, or whatever it is, as a concept, refers to more than just technological revolutions. And I think that's an absolutely vital part of the understanding. Now, what I've represented on screen here is what I believe to be the transition that took place fundamentally into the global digital revolution that took place in the latter half of the last century. The sorting of people on the basis of class, and it's very important to understand that this is about class, the sorting of people into different categories that are located in different places, that work in different ways, and that are increasingly polarized and marginalized in various ways in the case of the latter 2 categories by the processes of the global digital revolution. Now, the point about a supposed transition from the third to a fourth industrial revolution is that in these terms, in the terms that you see represented on screen here, there is no such phenomenon. In fact, there is a deepening of what we might think about as the third industrial revolution as a social phenomenon, a consolidation of it and a resuscitation of it in the face of attacks on the nature of the international economy that are discussed by people like Joseph Stiglitz, etc. So the central point I'm making here is that in relation to issues in the North, there is indeed a deepening of the third industrial revolution as we understand it as a social phenomenon, and nothing like what is claimed to be a fourth industrial revolution. And the same, in fact, applies to accounts of what industrial revolutions mean for the South. Now, here are some quotations from some of the writing that I've done. And I've chosen these 3 quotations because what they do is make the point that the phenomenon of the marginalization, the exploitation, the colonization in broad terms and in neo-colonial terms now of the countries of the South, and in particular, I think from our point of view, a concern with Africa, is a continuing deepening of colonization into decolonization. I think other speakers have made the point, but of course, it's very important to understand that from the point of view of Africa, slavery was the central experience of the first industrial revolution. The deepening and the codification of imperialism in Africa was the central experience of the second industrial revolution. And of course, the phenomena around the world brought about by the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, of offshoring, outsourcing, onshoring to the cloud, et cetera, or outsourcing to the cloud. All of those kinds of things are deepening marginalizations of countries of the South across the world. And again, I believe there's no case to be made that there is a substantial phenomenon that we might call a fourth industrial revolution, but there is indeed a consolidation of an ideology that serves to further exploit, to marginalize, and of course also to conceal those processes in ideological terms. It's important, I think, to understand that the methodology that I've employed in my arguments in my various writings is about thick description of historical phenomena that we associate with various industrial revolutions. And it is in deep, thick description type, longue durée, as it's called by historians, accounts of historical phenomena across revolutions, that it becomes very clear that the fourth industrial revolution as an historical phenomenon, in fact, does not exist. Now, let me get to the question of modes of production. What I've tried to represent on screen here are the central concepts that come to us from the classical account of a mode of production, which of course is associated with Karl Marx. Now, the important point about a mode of production in these theoretical terms is that it is an articulation of forces of production and of relations of production. Now, part of the problem with the way that people articulate the notion of a fourth industrial revolution, and others indeed, is that they talk about it around in most of the writing and most of the understandings of it that we see in academic writing and in political processes and social processes around the world, is that it is construed as a technological revolution, that in itself is thought to exhaust the notion of an industrial revolution. And so it runs down this particular stratum here of this diagram down the left-hand side of my screen here. These particular ideas are articulated in relation to the idea of an industrial revolution. Now, the point I've already made is that, in fact, it is at the level of relations of production and the various relationships that make up those phenomena in the world that we need to actually understand the issues around a fourth industrial revolution. And it's very clear that those kinds of transformations in things like the labor process, labor relations, social and cultural processes, and the nature of geopolitics, the patterns of exploitation internationally in economic and social terms, that those kinds of things have not transformed in any fundamental way from what we call the third to the fourth industrial revolution, a putative fourth industrial revolution. And a lot of the arguments that I've developed in my writings have shown that, I think, quite comprehensively to be the case, or if you like, not to be the case. But coming back to the idea of a technological revolution as being something into which we can dissolve the notion of a fourth industrial revolution, I think it's also quite clear from the evidence that technological processes around the world have not, in fact, shown us that there is any transition at the level of things like forces, means of production, raw materials, instruments of production, etc., to something like a putative fourth industrial revolution. And so at another level, I think that it's also quite clear from the evidence about technological transformation that there has not been a transition or a transformation in the mode of production. But having said that, we need to go back to an understanding that this particular articulation of a mode of production by Karl Marx in himself has, of course, been historically falsified. And we know that, of course, in relation to the classical case of the Soviet Union, but in relation to other kinds of issues around the world. And I can't go into the details now. But the point is that relations of production and forces of production aren't intimately tied to each other in the sense that they're identified with each other, particularly in historical time. And in certain kinds of situations, subsequent scholarship to Marxism has shown us quite clearly that relations of production can run ahead of the development of forces of production. And of course, vice versa, forces of production can run ahead of the development of relations of production. And so what that means is this particular phenomenon, and here's a very nice quotation from one of the scholars that I'm talking about, which is to say that for Marxism, and by the way, G.A. Cohen, who is a very important source for me in understanding Marxism, has I think shown this issue to be also quite clear in his writings, that this is in fact the correct interpretation, if you like, from a realist point of view, of the way that Marx was writing about the notion of modes of production. But in any particular social phenomenon at any point in time, there are multiple modes of production, not just one. And that's an important challenge to the question that is posed to us by Southern Centre. Is there a change in the mode of production represented by the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution? And the answer is that, in fact, you need to look at multiple modes of production. And of course, that allows us to understand issues like the relationship between imperialism and the Second Industrial Revolution that took place in substantially the same part of the world, the systematization of the colonization of Africa in that particular point in time. So that's, in answer to that question, that's what I want to suggest, that the evidence shows us, if we examine the nature of both technological transformations, innovations, et cetera, over time in society, and also transformations of social relations. So the myth, I think I've seen the Southern Centre calling it a fantasy. I believe there is such a phenomenon, the myth of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I think it functions ideologically like many other myths in society, and we can talk about that if you'd like to in questions. But here are statements from the two ideologues of the Fourth Industrial Revolution that I think are significant for us. Of course, Klaus Schwab being the lead global ideologue of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and Tshilidzi Mawala being the lead ideologue in the South African context. And these grand, staggering claims, fantastical claims about transformations in the offing in South Africa. But in fact, if you look at their own writings, their substantial writings, there is very little evidence that they put forward in real terms that justify these kinds of fantastical claims about our present or our future. And here in the last slide that I want to just show you are some evidence for the evidence that are put forward by these two writers in their key core central works, Mawala's work and Schwab's work. And if you look at them, they really are mundane features of information technology at work in our society. And as you look at the screen now, you will see that every single one of them is in fact simply a deepening of the Third Industrial Revolution and its technologies rooted way back in the previous century. There's nothing here that is earth-shattering. And in the evidence that these writers adduce themselves to support their claims, there simply is no support for this notion of a fantastical Fourth Industrial Revolution. And if you look at some of the incipient technologies that are indeed, I think, revolutionary in their own context at the moment, things like nanotechnology in medicine, self-driving automobiles, things of that sort. Indeed, they are revolutionary, as I say, in their own research contexts, but none of them have moved beyond that. If you look at the evidence of the researchers who do the work that they do, beyond those kinds of in-research program types of constraints that they're working with. And so those are the claims that I make about the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution in the writings that I do. And I trust that that summary gets in on 15 minutes. I think it does. And I hope it helps contribute to today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your presentation and for providing his historical basis of evidence for reflecting and challenging, as you call it, the fantasy of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. To reflect on these three incredible presentations, we would like to invite Tessa Dooms, who is a sociologist, development practitioner, and political analyst. She started her career in academia and has moved to work in diverse sectors, including in government, NGOs, and the private sector. In 2015, she was appointed to the National Planning Commission to advise the president on the implementation of the National Development Plan for South Africa. She has successfully led a youth policy think tank called Youth Lab, has lectured at 3 South African universities, and is also on the board of Kagiso Trust. She holds an MA in sociology from the University of the Witwatersrand. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat to the previous speakers. Tessa, over to you. Thank you for joining us from fieldwork in Eastern Cape.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you can hear me, Ruth.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. So yes, I am in the midst of field work. So if you do see things that seem unseemly, I apologize. So my reflection is going to be really short because I want to just point out a few things about the way we think about this moment in our economic condition that we find ourselves in South Africa, but also what kind of discourse we are engaged in. I think for me, the first thing is that what's important for me is whatever we are in right now, where we are, how we are perceiving changes in the world, changes in the economy, in what we are producing and how we're producing it. What does this mean for people's lives and for people's ability to locate themselves as economic actors in our country? That's what I preoccupy myself with. So what are some of the things that has come up through these presentations and that I've been thinking about that characterize the world we're in right now? The first is that regardless of whether we're in the third, the fourth, or the first industrial revolution right now, we have a crisis of growing unemployment and growing inequality that is going unchecked and unabated. And we need to keep in our minds very, very clearly that those things need to be addressed. And we need to think about the implications of both the ideas that are being put out into the world that we are having to contend with, and the ways of doing and the economic models that are being put into the world and what they're going to mean for us. So the fourth industrial revolution, for me, I don't think we're very clear about what it is. I agree that there's a lot of talk about a fourth industrial revolution, but not a lot of substance to it. But I think that there is a point to be made about the ways in which technology is impacting on people's lives, their identities, the way they're able to interact, and the way they're able to access economic opportunities and access work. So if I think about the first presentation, I do think we need to ask serious questions about the place of Africans in an increasingly digital world, an increasingly digitalized world, both as people whose data is going into the world and is being used and is being commodified, and the fact that because of the way where we're situated in terms of how tech and the tech industry has developed, for the most part, Africans and particularly South Africans are going to be either people who are giving out data or people who are consuming data, but we are certainly not in a position as a country where many people are going to benefit off data. And that's a serious question we need to ask. What does it mean to live in a society where data has become commodified? And where do we locate ourselves as Africans and South Africans in the commodification of data? How do we make sure that our data does not become something that is just yet another commodity that that is taken from us, yet another way in which we are exploited, yet another way in which big business and capital gets to flourish and thrive, and we have no stake except that we are useful to the system? How do we get involved in that? The response in our country thus far, even at a government level, has been we need, tech entrepreneurs, and we need to get involved in coding and apps and all of that. And I think that is a very small part of the larger value chain around digitalization. If you think about the Facebooks of the world, the Googles of the world, those big tech companies that are trading in data and are making money off data and are creating industries around data, the app development really is already at the point where we're even becoming a app creator is going to become something that's going to be done by AI rather than by people. So we can't get into the game at the stage where we are just, third or fourth tier using platforms that already exist to create apps. We need to be thinking about how are we managing data? How are we harnessing data? How are we making sure our data doesn't get used? And how are we monetizing our own data in a system where there's a digitization and a commodification of data? I don't think we've answered that question sufficiently as a society. The second question around it for me is the question about what happens when tech does start to take over a lot of spaces where people are employed. In a society like ours, again, where financialization in the financial sector is a big part of what's employing people, the service industry, big part of what's employing people, those kind of spaces where work is starting to be taken over by technology. If we just look at the banking industry in South Africa, I come from a colored community. 10 to 15 years ago, for colored young people, the idea of working in a bank as a clerk was a real thing that was part of the psyche of how you're going to make a productive life for yourself as a colored young person in South Africa. That no longer exists as a real option because branches are closing all over the country and tech has taken over the way in which the banking system and financial services works. That's a real material change that's happening in our society. It's not just a matter of, the ideology. That's a practical material change. And we have to think about what happens when tech starts to take over particular kinds of sectors. The retail sector, there are many possibilities for job losses in the retail sector. If you look at the North has gone down that path already, where being a teller, which is what a lot of people coming into low-income jobs in our country are at least hoping to be able to work in the retail sector. Those kinds of jobs can have technology that comes and takes over some of those jobs. We can't run away from that. But there's an argument that I do want to make and put on the table that I've heard made in different ways, in different places, and I'm trying to concretize in my own mind, is that in a society where we are going to increasingly have more and more tech taking over, particularly menial jobs. And by that, I really mean single task jobs or jobs that are not in the knowledge economy. Because I think the knowledge economy, there's a particular set of issues around what tech can take over there and AI can take over there. But where the targets are, we need to think of, in terms of work, are single task jobs. So what happens if we do have a situation where tech increasingly takes over those kinds of forms of work? For me, the answer is two things. One is that it should be that we create a society where we encourage tech that allows people more freedom to do less menial work, less single task work, less work that is that lacks kind of agency, creativity, that is that's very static and automated almost, where people have to just be cogs in a machine. We should encourage tech that takes away those kinds of jobs if we are ready to build a society that says if people aren't doing those kinds of forms of work, they are then enabled and freed up to do more meaningful work. And they're enabled and freed up to think about what it is as human beings that is essentially human and makes us more than just the tasks we do. What parts of human society do we not want tech to take over? So I make a strong case, for example, that we need to start looking at things like sport, arts, culture, care economy work, social sector work, because as much as we could have, care work increasingly done through tech, I would prefer not to have that be the case. I'd prefer that there are certain things that we ring fence and say, these things are essentially human, and we want to keep them that way because it makes us a better society. In the same way that we want to take away things that have people doing things that they don't find meaningful. And maybe there's an opportunity here to invite tech to do things that free us to do more meaningful work. Now, I understand that that could be seen as fantastical, and I am happy to do that. The reason why I'm happy to do that is because I think that we have one or two positions we can take here. One is we can allow capital to do what it does, and it can lead, and it can guide, and it can direct the way in which it's going to increasingly use tech to disrupt the economy and shape the way humans are going to live their lives. Or particularly as social scientists, we can start imagining a world where we say what the parameters for what tech and its introduction into society should be, so that we create a more just world. We create a world that is less alienated. We create a world where people are not doing meaningless work, but they're freed up to do meaningful work. We create a world where exploitative labor, and particularly the forms of exploitative labor that have high levels of indignity are reduced because tech takes those over. Let's think about what we would want tech to do in order to create a more just society, and a society where people are actually freed up to be more human and to do more meaningful work. And if we start to think about that, I think, and this is my last contribution, I think it opens us up to several important debates about the future of work. And I'm only going to mention two of them. The first important debate about the future of work that I think thinking about what we do with tech allows us to think about is whether or not we can use social protection much more dynamically to give people income so that they are freed up to do work that they want to do and meaningful work and start to be productive in better ways. We've been having conversations about social protection in South Africa that I think have been very limited and limiting, but I think we need to have much bigger conversations about it. Job guarantee conversations are happening in the North en masse because we are starting to realize that the space for certain kinds of forms of labor is going to decrease. And we have to replace that with other forms of work, but we also need to think about other forms of income. And we can have a situation where we think about those forms of income as social protection first, and then free people up to productive labor that looks different and could be different for people. But the second thing that I think it really opens us up to, something that the IOL keeps on flagging. I think WEF has also got a list like this, where they talk about what are some of the skills needed for the future of work. And this is not limited to 4IR. But every time I look at this list of skills for the future of work, and this includes tech and the knowledge economy, it's all kinds of things that you find in the social sector. It's analytic skills, problem-solving skills. It's very much human skills. And that means that there's also an opening for different forms of work to emerge and for us to invest in not just tech and the sciences as we think about the future of work, but to invest in the humanities and the social sector and the care economy and the things that make us more human. And this kind of skill sets that we need in order to navigate a world where we have hopefully more time to be more human and to do things that are more productive for ourselves and for the way we want to live our lives, rather than simply productive for the purposes of capitalist production. So those are my reflections and my thoughts. And I hope that we do think about this as practically as possible, and think about it as creatively as possible, so that we don't get bogged down or left behind.
Thank you so much, Tessa, for your critical input. A reminder that whether 4IR is a revolution or not, there is a real material change that's taking place, and that there's a role for us as social scientists, as scholar activists, to reimagine what we think the parameters of tech should be towards a more just world. I wanted to say that this is the first of a 6-part dialogue series. Colleagues posted a poster that outlines what the next ones will be. Our next dialogue will be next month, again, the 3rd Tuesday, June 21st, and it will focus on algorithmic management, the changing labor process and conditions of work. So we are going to be grappling with various of these questions that have been raised today in more depth, including the one on social protection. However, I did want to give panelists the time where we have about 5-6 minutes to respond to both questions that have been raised and any comments by Tessa. And there's questions, I would group them into a couple of different groups. So one is around the digital divide. How do we breach, Zolani asks, the digital technological divide? Munyarazi then says, there's still a yawning gap. How do we develop strategies that kind of reflect these realities and make sure that we don't miss the boat on a society 5.0? There's a question from Kelvin around the environment. Can digital tech reduce greenhouse gases and lead us to a zero carbon future? Sarah asks about the question of employment. What economic policies are being imagined to go hand in hand with 4IR? And like Tessa, raises the question of entrepreneurship. And then we have a question also from Shanae, this one specifically to Nanjala, on the relationship between the governance of the internet and post-colonial attitudes to democracy and freedom among African governments. So feel free to type any further questions in the chat. Perhaps they can be answered as such, but I did want to give speakers 1 to 2 minutes each, just for final reflections before we close.
I mean, those are a lot of questions. I'm not sure we're going to have a chance to get to not just all of them, any of them. I guess I would say that one of the biggest challenges that we have in thinking through the tech space for me is that we always tend to conceive of these things very narrowly in terms of the challenge that's ahead of us. And that's a product of the way in which the epistemologies of science, technology, mathematics, whatever, urge people to think. So you break down this problem into its smallest parts and you address the part that is in front of you. And then you hope that someone else somewhere around the world is doing that, that when it comes together, that it tells the story altogether. Whereas when you're thinking in social sciences and humanities, not always, but often the epistemology allows you to, encourages you to think about things in the broadest sense and to have as many variables in the pot before you go about making inferences and conclusions. And so to just pick on the question about democracy and politics and all of that, I see the things that tech has made possible in a lot of different societies. And in my writings, that's one of the things I always try to focus, is to not just focus on the things that have gone wrong, but also to think about the people who are using technology to bring their communities together, to preserve indigenous languages, to tell different narratives about what it means to belong to specific societies. That is also tech, that is also the internet, that is also the digital age. And I think what you want is to get to a point where you incubate the good and you address the bad, but you have to be honest about the bad in order to be able to do that. And so what the point is of all of these conversations for me is to keep people's agenda focused on both on keeping things in perspective. And I think that sort of answers the question about democracy and also the question about, what about being left behind? I mean, FOMO can't be a justification for some of the social consequences that we've witnessed today. That we're afraid of fear of being left behind cannot be a justification for compounding some of the injustices that our societies are living with today. I think people should be able to opt in and opt out, because that is also freedom and that is also agency. And platforms that require people to opt in and without their informed consent, I think are not freedom-making practices. I know I've tried to answer like 7 interconnected questions at one go, but I hope that there's something in there that makes sense for someone.
Thanks so much, Nanjala. Indeed, it is not easy to address all. I wanted to pass on, invite Trevor.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for those comments by Tessa, which I really agree with. And I think the real issue is, firstly, how to defend the working class from the ravages of technologies, which, on the one hand, taking things forward can be viewed as advancements, but because these technologies are in the hands of the bosses, of the capitalists, they end up being weapons, against the working class. So that's the problem. So, and that's the primary contradiction. So basically, the best things can come, to humanity, but because of inequality, because, a few people monopolize, so you'll find that the majority is left suffering, is left stranded. In fact, the hardship continues. So I think one thing for the trade union movement, because the trade union movement is an important part of the working class movement. Good people, class politics is so important because the capitalists, they're a class, and they push, their agenda. Whether it's Elon Musk, he was born in South Africa, he's conquering the world, messing up with Twitter, whether it's Oppenheimer, whether it's Mutsipe, black bourgeoisie, they've got one agenda: to make more money at the expense of the working class. Indeed, often also these days at the expense of even sections of the middle class. Of course, we, the middle class, they just want us to be their functionaries, to be their cadre, to supervise workers, to make sure that we teach students to think correctly. But we can take a stand, we can take a stance, and side with the working class and actually, fight, for certain things, such as, I think Tessa Dooms discussed social protection. Yes, basic income grant, job protections. The unions must also, intervene strongly in discussions of technology, what kind of technologies are introduced in a factory, in a workplace, and set certain terms, draw certain lines. There must be no, job losses. And if those job losses are there, this is what we should do to protect those workers. But ultimately, as long as the power remains, with the capitalists, as long as the power remains with the capitalist governments, the ANC government, it's a capitalist government. It dances to the music of the capitalists. So as long as those people are in power, we're going to have a problem. So it's most important that, we fight for those reforms, we fight for those immediate things, but in our head, we should be building up people's power, workers' power, to get rid of the capitalist control of the economy and to replace it with socialization of the economy with workers' power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trevor. And Ian, we'd welcome you for your last reflection.
Okay, I think there's a lot that could be said, but I'll just say one thing that I think is important next week, which is that the World Economic Forum is, of course, going to be meeting next week in Davos. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of the kind of rhetoric that we've been talking about today in relation to the triangular relationship, if you like, between the COVID-19 pandemic, the idea of the fourth industrial revolution, and the economy and the situation that the world economy is in at the moment. I want to just draw people's attention here because I think it's quite revealing in the way that the World Economic Forum does its research. If you look at the methodologies that are used both in Klaus Schwab's 2016 book and in the annual report that they publish on the future of jobs, the WEF Future of Jobs report published each year, there's a remarkable methodological sleight of hand that you will find in those texts, which is that the sample, if you like, of people that they interview in order to make claims about the future of jobs in the world are in fact selected CEOs and human resource section heads of large companies around the world. And it's mind-boggling, in fact, that the claims that are made about the future of jobs by the World Economic Forum are based, if you like, on the wish lists and projected envisaged futures of large companies around the world by their management. So I'm just urging people to have a look at the methodologies that are employed when these kinds of claims are made. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today. Nanjala Nyabola, Trevor Ngwane, Tessa Dooms, and Ian Moll. It has been a real pleasure to have this discussion. You've raised many issues, and we hope that we'll be able to continue these throughout the dialogue. I also would just want to thank those at SCIS who have been in the background doing the communications and enabling us to have this forum, Ntabi, Kitso, Hannah, Sepati, thank you so much. It would have been impossible to do this with you, as well as Pauline, of course. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be on June 21st. It will focus on algorithmic management, the changing labor process and the conditions of work. It'll feature Dr. Umarani from the ILO, who's been trailblazing much of the research of the ILO on digital tech, Dr. Gayatri Nair and Sai Amulia from India, and Dr. Derli Sanchez from Colombia, and Lucas Souza from Brazil. So we hope to see you then. If you'd like to stay abreast of our upcoming webinars, you can sign up to our listserv, which I will post in the chat. And thank you so much to you, participants who raised critical questions. And I hope that next time we'll have a little bit more time to have a little bit more discussion. With that, we will close the session. Thank you and have a good evening.